So our next speaker is a virtual presentation, and it's Todd Dudley, and he's acknowledging the cultural legacy of bush regeneration and ecological restoration. So have we got that lined up, Alice?
Great, thanks very much. That was a great presentation, that last one. We've certainly had similar experiences in our area with people coming from disadvantaged backgrounds and really getting a lot of different mental and physical health benefits from doing ecological restoration. So yeah, my talk is, I'm just going to give a quick plotted history of bush regeneration over the last 50 years, just because I think it might be of interest to some people in case they're not aware of the origins of it, and then just talking a bit about the where to from here. So I first became aware of Albert Morris, which is now an SER award, through reading a really great book on ecological restoration history that was written by William Jordan III called Making Nature Whole. And he was a botanist and who was interested in the plants around the Broken Hill area, and he achieved really amazing restoration results by just excluding stock and rabbits. And as far as anybody knows, he was one of the first people to do a restoration project in Australia that's been recorded. Then after the 1930s, there was quite a long period when not a lot seemed to be happening. And then in the late 60s and early 70s, the Bradley sisters were critical in establishing the practice of bush regeneration around Sydney. They started off by doing weeding in bushland reserves around the Mossman area. But it was a really important breakthrough because they didn't just do the work, they actually published a document which was called the Bradley method that actually really set some standards and principles and philosophies about how you should go about ecological restoration, and there hadn't really been anything done like that before, not as far as I know anyway. And some of their main principles were securing the best areas first, minimising disturbance and not over clearing, and just working with the regenerative capacity of the area. And in the mid-70s, the National Trust started getting into bush regeneration in New South Wales as well, and running courses. So that was one of the first times when bush regeneration or ecological restoration was started to become formally taught as a practice, as opposed to just going out and doing it. So that was a really important breakthrough as well. Luckily for me, I was living in Sydney in the early 80s when bush regeneration started to transition from a volunteer into a more of an industry and a paid job. And so, yeah, that was very fortunate for me. And I also, I did a National Trust bush regeneration course at that time, and through that, I ended up getting a job on the local council with running the first bush regeneration crew on the northern beaches of Sydney. And when I started doing bush regeneration, there was only 14.5 million people living in Australia. In the 1980s, also, there was a fairly significant incident or issue which arose up in Wingham-Brush, which was one of the first areas where rainforest regeneration was attempted. And so at that time, there was quite a controversy because the people undertaking that project decided to use methods that were in conflict with what the Bradley method recommended. And at the time, it was considered pretty controversial, but it wasn't very long before people realised that you did need to adapt your methods according to what was most appropriate for the site. So in the case of Wingham-Brush, it was conceded that the use of chemicals and fairly significant disturbance was actually necessary to be able to restore that particular ecosystem. And since then, obviously, that in some cases that's been the way that things needed to go. So that was a bit of a challenge to the Bradley method at the time, but a lot of the Bradley methods principles are still relevant, but we've also moved on and expanded beyond that, and understand that you have to do things according to the site-specific requirements. In the late 1980s, when the first bush regeneration course at Ryde TAFE was held, I did the second course with Robin Buchanan, and also in 1989 she released a book called Bush Regeneration, which was also really important because it really expanded upon the previous principles of the Bradley method and other people's experience, and collated that all in a fairly comprehensive publication. And I was lucky enough to go to the book launch for that, where it was launched by the former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. So yeah, having those, starting to have more formal education and more publications about bush regeneration helped to build the interest and expertise. Around that time also, there was the formal national recognition of land care with partnership between the National Farmers Federation and the ACF, and that formalised the growing importance of dealing with degradation of land all around Australia. Yeah, so around that time I actually moved from New South Wales to Tasmania, and during the 1990s, one conservation concept that gradually became more prominent was the idea of landscape connectivity, which was all about making sure that there was adequate connectivity and corridors for species to move through the landscape. That was promoted fairly heavily through the Wild Country program that the Wilderness Society initiated, and then led to the establishment of a number of landscape scale projects around Australia, such as Gondwana Link and Great Eastern Ranges, and we've got our own project called the East Coast Conservation Corridor. Then in the early 2000s, there was a decision made to transition from land care to a natural resource management approach for administering and conservation expenditure around Australia. I don't think that's been a big success. It's, in my opinion, NRM's generally been a fairly top-heavy corporate model. It's not as grassroots or community-based as land care was, and the main intention was to try and make expenditure more strategic rather than being more ad hoc, but I don't think that's necessarily been the case. Around about this time too, there was the rise of offsets, which basically mean net loss in most cases. There's been quite a lot of critiquing of that concept, but that became more and more of a characteristic in quite a lot of land management circles. In 2009, Robin rewrote her bush regeneration book. It was called Restoring Natural Areas, and that updated some aspects from her previous book. Probably one of the most significant things in the new book was she highlighted the importance of the concept of resilience. So that, as we know, is a really important aspect of doing bush regeneration and ecological restoration, being able to look at sites and assess their relative ecological condition and health, and then be able to prioritise what's the most appropriate methodology for trying to restore them, or even if it's possible to restore them. In 2016, we had the SER National Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration in Australia, which is also a really important publication because it just built even more on previous knowledge and demonstrated the need to have really skilled practitioners to do ecological restoration well, and produced a template, as was produced in the last presentation, that assessment wheel for looking at ecosystem recovery and resilience and how that can be applied. And there's also some of the other important things in that publication was differentiating between the definition of ecological restoration as opposed to rehabilitation and mitigation, which is really important for making sure that we're clear about what those terms mean. And it also was very, built on articulated the practice of science and the ethics of ecological restoration, including the importance of reference ecosystems, which again, the previous presentation did a good job of doing that. And reference ecosystems are the cornerstone of ecological restoration and provide the foundation and context upon which restoration practices, science and ethics can be passed on from one generation to the next, which is, I think it's really important. You can't have a cultural practice that's got longevity unless it's based on something. And as important as climate change action is, if the aim is to manage and redesign nature in order to keep economic growth going, i.e. business as usual, sustainability is a bit of a meaningless concept. Another development in recent years has been the realisation that ecological restoration is not only a really important nature conservation strategy, it's also has a number of other social and economic benefits, especially for in rural and remote communities, such as providing employment and education opportunities and improving physical and mental health. So there's a lot more understanding and work going into trying to quantify those benefits to build the case for the importance of ecological restoration has in other, there's a number of different benefits it has beyond benefiting biodiversity. And the two reports that were published in 2020 and 2021, one of them was called Delivering Economic Stimulus Through the Conservation and Land Management Sector, which was a report by Ernst & Young, and another report, Working with Nature, which came out this year through the Pew Foundation, were both really useful documents in helping to build that important case for showing that investing in conservation is also really beneficial for rural and remote communities. Also in 2020, we had the IUCN guidelines for conserving connectivity through ecological networks and corridors, which elaborated on the importance of maintaining and restoring landscape connectivity. And now, coming up on the 5th of June is the official launch of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, which is an exciting prospect. So that's just a bit of a quick run through of the some of the more significant milestones, I suppose, over the last 50 years in particular, and how something that virtually didn't exist not very long ago has become a really widespread practice all around Australia now. It's something that we really need to be proud of and probably promote a lot more than we do. Now I just want to finish off my talk by just talking about a few things that we need to address to make sure that ecological restoration achieves its full potential over the next 100 years or more. So first of all, we obviously, at the moment, one of the biggest problems is that while we're busy trying to restore landscapes, there's a lot of other activities going on that are in conflict with what we're trying to achieve. So we need more holistic policies and laws that complement restoration efforts rather than conflict with them. I think we really need to even think about looking at a bioregional governance arrangement that's sympathetic to land care and restoration rather than growth and development. A neoliberal model of outsourcing and privatisation and deregulation isn't fit for purpose in the 21st century if we have an imperative of ecological sustainability. We need to aim for net gain, improving condition, increasing the extent of native vegetation cover and habitat, improving the status of threatened species. As I mentioned before, there was only 14.5 million people in Australia when I started doing bush regeneration. That's increased by 10 million people over the time that I've been doing it. I think we need to move towards having a state ecologically sustainable population policy for Australia, because a big Australia makes nature conservation harder. We need, one of the other obvious deficiencies that's never been addressed is having reliable long-term funding. There's always been a struggle to get consistent funding so that you can plan over a number of years for your projects. All effective land management needs reliable long-term funding to be successful. Having volunteers is always going to be an important part of conservation, but we can't, the amount of the scale and the timelines involved in the restoration work that we need to do requires significant and reliable funding, and it's way beyond just a voluntary project. And another trend has obviously been in recent years to move towards trying to access more private funding, and last night's federal budget is a good example of there's the steady decline in government's commitment to funding the environment. So while there's definitely been some benefits in partnering with in the private sector, we really need the government to, as custodians of our natural heritage, to significantly increase their commitment to looking after the environment. There's always talk about skills shortage. Well, one of the biggest skills shortages in Australia is people who are really skilled at looking after the environment. So we should be investing in that and training people in it. We need something like a Medicare levy, I think, along those lines to generate the type of consistent and regular funding that we need. Environmental education hasn't been enough resources, or it hasn't become a major part of school curriculums in most places in Australia that I know of anyway. And it's absolutely essential. There has been obviously quite a few gains made at a post-school level with things like TAFE courses and uni, incorporating restoration into uni degrees, but at a school level, there's nowhere near enough environmental education. We need to raise ecologically aware and literate citizens if nature's to be valued and loved. And as one USA conservation writer, John Rodman, wrote years ago, he said that it's unlikely there will be a revolution in ethics without a revolution in perception. I don't think also that as a whole we've been as good as we could be at documenting all of the achievements and outcomes that the conservation movement and the restoration movement have achieved over the years. We're doing what we can, but because there's a lack of awareness of environmental history in the general community, they don't appreciate or understand how important our contribution's been to nature conservation and to society in general. So I think we need to try and work on lifting our game in that area so that people really fully understand how important our contribution's been to Australian society and the environment. I'd like to see more emphasis put on the maximising the ethical values that can be generated through ecological restoration too. So there's a whole lot of really positive ethics and values that can be associated with doing restoration work, like building positive relations with nature, giving back to nature, taking responsibility for the environment, increasing caring and understanding and appreciation. So through ecological literacy, acknowledging and rectifying past environmental abuse and celebrating renewal of life and beauty, etc., etc. Yeah, so there's some real scope for, because that's really one of the greatest values of ecological restoration is, apart from the benefits to the environment, it really is a good vehicle for cultivating strong ecological values in people who participate in it. And then just to finish off, a quote from John Winarski, who was speaker at this conference, who on the conversation recently, he said, "We live in a remarkable land with so much beauty, intrigue and wonder. We are corroding our nature and will pass on to our descendants a land that is less healthy, less diverse and less wonderful." So my comment on that is, if sustainability means anything at all, it's the notion of passing on the natural world in better condition than you found it. We're clearly not doing that. Ecological restoration offers us a means to not only improve the condition and expand the extent of native vegetation and habitat, but also a cultural legacy that provides the practical, scientific, ethical and values basis for a more resilient and healthy future for Australia's biodiversity and landscapes. As Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring, once said, "Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts." Thank you.
Beautiful. Oh, awesome. Thanks, Todd. Well, that's a lovely wrap up at the end there, but we better keep going because we've run out of time for questions. So yep. We'll move right along to